We're looking in Nagorny Karabakh at a dispute that dates back 100 years, but historically both the Armenians and the Azerbaijanis for much longer than that have regarded this territory, Karabakh, as a very important and special place for their culture and for their people. We're talking about a Armenian majority territory, a very fertile, beautiful territory, economically quite successful territory, with an Armenian majority which has a long cultural tradition of Armenian heritage, but which is also located very firmly inside the geographical and economic space of Azerbaijan, and also has a Azeri minority who've lived there for many centuries, and one town which was a very important town, Shusha, for the Azeris and for Azerbaijan. So a place which has strong meaning and strong claims for two peoples. If we come to the 20th century and the era in which empires were coming to an end and nation states were beginning to form, we saw the Armenian and the Azerbaijani nations fighting for control of Karabakh at the beginning of the 20th century, before and after the October Revolution. Then obviously the Soviet Union was formed in 1920-21. Azerbaijan and Armenia both became parts of the Soviet Union, and in 1921 the decision was made to give this territory some degree of autonomy, but to locate it within Azerbaijan. So you had an Armenian majority autonomous territory inside Azerbaijan, with Armenia literally only a few miles away. So you had an inherently unstable situation with people inside Azerbaijan but looking just over the border to Armenia. And in the Soviet period you also had lots of disputes in which the Armenians of Karabakh wanted more autonomy, more rights, more contact with Armenia, and the Azerbaijanis didn't want to give it to them. So a lot of tension within the Soviet era, within the communist era, but obviously because we're talking about a totalitarian state, that was suppressed. That didn't get much beyond the surface. But as soon as the 1985 coming to power of Mikhail Gorbachev brought a thaw in the Soviet Union, this problem began to creep up the agenda again, and in 1988 we saw the Armenians appealing directly to Moscow for this territory to be transferred from Azerbaijan to Armenia within the Soviet Union. And we saw in February 1988 lots of things happening. The first strike in the Soviet Union for generations, the first mass street protest in both Armenia and Azerbaijan, the first time that Communist Party officials were defying the center in Moscow, the first violence, first pogroms with Armenians being killed on the streets of Azerbaijan. So all within a matter of a few weeks, this problem came to the surface. And I think I could say right from the beginning this was a clash which was irreconcilable. Both communities were living in their own insulated world. Both found it impossible to recognize the rights of the others. Both wanted Karabakh. And the ironic thing being that these were two communities who on a day-to-day level intermarried, they traded together. But on a political, historical level, both of them could not accept the claim that Nagorny Karabakh was part of the other. And so the violence escalated. You saw essentially a mini Soviet civil war, a civil war inside the Soviet Union in 1991. And then with the end of the Soviet Union, at the end of 1991, two new states are formed, Armenia and Azerbaijan. And because of the way the boundaries had been drawn in Soviet times, the international recognized boundary was that this territory, Karabakh, was part of Azerbaijan. This was obviously unacceptable to the Armenians, and so it turned from a Soviet civil war into a war between two states, new state of Armenia backing the secession of the Armenians inside Azerbaijan. And if you add to that all the new heavy weaponry left behind by the Soviet army with the end of the Soviet Union, we suddenly had tanks and artillery and airplanes and lots of unemployed Russian soldiers fighting on both sides, and the whole thing escalated into a massive war. If you talk to anyone on both sides, they both use history, and they start talking about, the Armenians in particular start talking about 301 AD, and they start looking back into the mist of time. I'm a bit sceptical about uses of history. I think this is very much a 20th century dispute, and that history is used to legitimize people's claims, which were actually only really articulated in the 20th century. You do end up encountering two universes which exist in parallel and which have nothing in common and which have no points of intersection. And that's been strengthened by the fact that these two nations, Armenia and Azerbaijan, for more than 10 years, for 15 years, have basically had no contact with one another. They also expelled the population of the other, so all the Armenians were expelled from Azerbaijan, with a very few exceptions, and vice versa. This was a very destructive war, and a lot of towns and villages were destroyed by it. You've got, on the land which is occupied by the Karabakh Armenians, particularly Nagorny Karabakh itself, you've seen a huge amount of reconstruction, and you'll see very little war damage on the Armenian side, apart from in the places which were the Azerbaijani villages. Again, inside Azerbaijan there are some areas which have been reconstructed. The terrible thing is, because there's this whole zone in the middle which is occupied by the Armenians, but they say they don't want to hold on to it, they're just keeping it as a buffer zone, they're keeping it to trade away in negotiations, so they accept basically that it's part of Azerbaijan, they don't want to keep it. And yet, because of the way things happened, it's now totally levelled to the ground. If Armenia had declared that Nagorno Karabakh was part of Armenia formally to the international community, they would have a lot more problems on their hand. They would be seen to be formally occupying the territory of another state. So Armenia, the state, it's useful to them to say that the Armenians of Azerbaijan want to separate. We are sympathetic with them, but we don't recognize their separation. In fact, what's happened on the ground is that in Nagorno Karabakh there's a road built by Armenians across from Armenia to Karabakh. They use the Armenian currency, they get Armenian money, the Karabakhis use Armenian passports. Armenians serve in the Karabakhi army, which it's hard to say if it's a Karabakh army or an Armenian army. They're so blended together. So although it's internationally on the territory of Azerbaijan, has become a province of Armenia. There has been a negotiating process from 1992, from the middle of the war, and some quite serious negotiators, and the USA, Russia and France are now the main negotiators on the conflict. So quite a serious negotiating process, and various attempts, particularly in 2001, to bring the two sides together and to strike a deal. The problem is that the two positions are still so far apart that actually almost no negotiator can bridge the gap. Only people who can really make a difference are the two sides, who could, by moving closer together. And yet both societies are still very, very much stuck in the fact that Nagorno-Karabakh is ours, that justice and truth are on our side, and no compromise. And the leaders, although possibly they'd like a deal, for one thing their whole identity has been formed around this conflict. For another thing, it's politically risky to start to kind of try and go against society and trying to change society and talk about compromise, because that could weaken you in terms of domestic politics. And so the leaders are also stuck. They're too timid or too afraid or too comfortable to start talking about compromise, start changing the terms of the debate within societies.